We're kicking it off a little bit late. We're just waiting for a few people to trickle in, but I just want to introduce everything now. So I'm the president of No Labels, Aiden Bryce, and this is the vice president, Joel. So just to give a little idea of what No Labels is about, it's Brown's only bipartisan political group, and as a group, there's three main things we try to accomplish. First, we try to bring in a variety of speakers to campus. Second, we try to work together on bipartisan policy issues. And third, we try to expand the campus discussion. And as you can see, that's exactly what we're trying to do with this debate here. So just to give an idea of I guess before turning to the specifics of the debate here, I just want to let everyone know that if you're interested in No Labels or you think it's something that's pretty cool, please come up to me after and we can talk about it. We always look for more people at our meetings and we always accept all political viewpoints. Joel's going to give us a little more information about how we're going to be running this debate and stuff like that. But before we do that, there's a lot of people to thank, but I also want to thank the No Labels e-board for helping so much put this together. August, Jen, and Rohan. I don't know where Rohan is, but thank you all. There he is. Thank you all for helping so much with this. And I'll turn it over to Joel now.
Thanks, Aiden. Before we start, I'm just going to go over the format of the debate real quick. So we have our capitalists on one side and our socialists on the other. But since not everyone shares the exact same viewpoint, we're going to give each debater 2 minutes at the beginning to introduce their economic philosophy and explain what it means to them. After that, we're going to get into the debate proper. And so for each question, every side will have 2 minutes to respond as a group. And then we'll have 4 minutes of crosstalk where everyone can speak. This portion should last us until about 8 o'clock, and then we'll devote the last 30 minutes to audience questions. Our moderator for tonight is Professor Emily Skarbek, who is a professor of political theory with Brown's Political Theory Project. I had the pleasure of taking a class with Emily this semester, and if anyone's interested in learning more about some of the topics discussed tonight, I can't recommend her enough. So with that, Professor Skarbek, I'll hand things over to you.
So first, join me in thanking No Labels for putting on such a really excellent event. We're really thankful for all the organizing that they've put in to this. The way we're going to run our civil debate and our civil discourse this evening is by having a total of 6 questions. They're going to start kind of broadly and then get into some very specific policy issues. We'll begin by introducing all of our panelists, and then they will each have 2 minutes to say a little something about kind of the general perspective in which they're coming from. From there, we'll move into the questions. In each round of questions, each side will have 2 minutes apiece to make their statements, and then there will be some back and forth, as Joel mentioned. My role here is mainly to enforce the civil discourse and to make sure that we all stay on time and in our own lanes. So without further ado, why don't we start on this side of the table and we'll move down.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to start by saying thanks to the yDSA who's here and has helped us prepare for this debate. Yeah, especially like Jackson, Turag, you guys helped us prepare. And if you like what you hear tonight, come to our meetings on Wednesdays in Smitty B. I'm Jessica. I'm a graduate student here at the Watson studying public affairs.
Hi, my name is Michael Freud. I'm a sophomore here at Brown. I'm an undergraduate studying philosophy. Again, thank you so much to the DSA for making a space on this campus. Thank you for No Labels for hosting this. I'm looking forward to this night, and I really hope we can provide some illuminating discourse.
My name is Diraj. I'm a freshman. I'm studying economics and international relations. And yeah, again, thank you so much for the Watson, for the pizza, and giving us the space. And I'm looking forward to the debate.
I'm Daniel. I'm a sophomore. I'm studying Latin American Studies and Economics. And thank you for No Labels and Watson for putting this on.
I'm Adam. I'm a freshman. Don't quite know what I'm studying yet. I'm treasurer with both the College Republicans and the Young Americans for Liberty here on campus. And I hope this will be a fun debate tonight.
Hello, my name is Ryan George. I'm a sophomore studying philosophy. People tell me I have a really great voice, so I hope you can get that tonight.
All right. So without further ado, we will alternate which sides start, I think, but I think Jessica, you want to?
We had
Diraj
an
is
order.
gonna
so-
Diraj.
Oh, you have an
Yeah.
order. Okay. 2 minutes begins.
So, having organized with the DSA for a couple years, like the most common question I get is what socialism is, right? And to me and to a lot of socialists, socialism is the full implementation of democracy, right? We live in a political system that is pretty democratic, and it's democratic because we have some say in the political decisions which affect our life. But our economic system isn't democratic at all. If you don't like where you're working or if you want to be paid more, you don't have any say really in making that economic decision. And in capitalism, right, the people who control what is produced, how it's produced, who gets paid, how they get paid, are the very few people who own the entire economy, the people who own capital. And essentially, that's an authoritarian system of control, right? Because if in a political system, we had a few people who controlled the entire system and what happened with it, and it was completely unaccountable, we'd call that an authoritarian system. But an economic system, which is the same way, authoritarian, has highly concentrated power, is called capitalism. And we don't see anything wrong with that for some reason. So our economy, like our society, shouldn't be organized around profits. It shouldn't be organized around what helps a few shareholders of a few big companies. It should be organized around what creates the most human good. What helps the most people? What's the best path for human civilization? And if you have an economic system which decides how things are distributed and how things are made entirely on the premise of profit, right, and the self-interest of a few capitalists, you're not going to have a society which is able to help people, flourish and help people find what they want to do, right? You're not going to be able to pursue human good or justice or democracy in a highly authoritarian capitalist system.
All right, moving on. Michael, or you have us order?
Yep. Yeah,
Yep.
Jessica?
I'm gonna go next.
Great.
So we can begin to understand economic systems by assessing the rules of the game. We have a lot of economic dysfunction and disorder. If we assume this is exogenous to the system, we're just taking the rules of the game for granted. Arthur Makiwan said this would be like playing checkers the usual way. It's not a bad game, but it's not a very enlightening one either. Right now, the rules allow for 3 families in the United States to have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. In the world, 22,000 children die of poverty every day, while billionaires in 2017 made enough money to end poverty 7 times over. This begs the question, who is writing the rules? We all know that the wealthy use their wealth to accumulate more. They purchase political dominance and use this power to sustain the institutions that give them a better way of life at the expense of others suffering. We mustn't tacitly accept this as a condition of our society. A prominent economist theorized that humans became the dominant species on Earth because we naturally adapted to care about one another, allowing us to cooperate and accomplish more together than we could separately. That economist was Adam Smith. We have the capacity to organize ourselves better. If we want to begin to set things right, we need to reevaluate the structures of economic life. Because these problems are not in our nature. They are rooted in the rules of the game. Why socialism? Because we need economic processes to manage natural resources and material resources. We need an economic system that is run in a way that benefits all people, instead of what we have now, which is us being run by it.
So I think it's often the case that we think of capitalism as just the default, as, it's the status quo and we're all so immersed in it that we just tend to accept it as like the natural state of things. But this really isn't the case. Capitalism is a specific economic system wherein the economy is controlled by private individuals. They control the factories, the things that we use to produce, and labor is sold by workers as a commodity for a wage. It's not the default system. It arose from specific historical forces at the end of feudalism. It's not something that we have to accept as natural, and it's not something that we have to see as the way that things always were. Instead, we think that there's an alternative in the form of socialism. We think that socialism is meaningfully more just, right? When you look at the way capitalism is structured, I think you'll find 2 things. You'll find that the ways in which the control over the things that we use to produce in the economy are distributed are grossly unjust and random. 50% of wealth in our economy is inherited, and most of that comes down to the lottery of birth. It's not the case that people are working their lives and then suddenly becoming rich enough to own a factory. Most of the wealth that people have and are using to profit, to use their factories to pay workers to create more things that they sell for profit, has been gathered by nothing more than luck. That's profoundly unjust to have an overclass of people who can make that profit, can continue to accumulate more, and an underclass of workers who will never be able to do that, but can only accept the wage that they're given by forces that are totally out of their control because we live in an undemocratic economic system. So what we would say is that, or what I would say at least, is that socialism is an alternative because it recognizes that our society has been built by everyone and that everyone has contributed to that, and that all the people contributing to the gains that we make as a society, the production that we do as a society, ought to see the gains that we make together rather than those gains just going to a select few who've been chosen by nothing other than luck. So that's why I'm a socialist.
Right, moving on to our other side. Do you have someone who wanted to start?
Yeah, I can start, sure. I'm philosophically a libertarian. My philosophy comes from the Lockean assumption that property rights are a means of establishing individuals as sovereign entities who are free from the control of their fellow man. In accordance with this, I believe in the free and open movement of goods, ideas, and people, and I think that each individual can do whatever he wants to do, own whatever he wants to own, and say whatever he wants to say, provided he does not directly harm the person or property of another individual. These two ideas coalesce into a libertarian principle known as the non-aggression principle. This states that no human being or human organization has the right to utilize force in order to achieve social, political, or personal goals. In my opinion, all people have a natural right to be assured of the sanctity of their property. This is a right to self-government, to control what you do, to control what happens to the things that you own, to control what happens to your life. I think in a pure democracy, this right is diminished by the rule of the majority. I think the majority itself is a tyrannical being. I think society is an illusion used to control people. Sociologist Franz Oppenheimer in 1926 stated that there are two means through which an individual can grow his wealth. The first is the economic means. This is a constructive process through which an individual adds something of value to society through entrepreneurship. He creates a good, he creates a technology that will improve the quality of living of those around him, and he markets that through a use of the existing mechanisms of currency in the society. The second means is the political means. This is inherently destructive. As individuals harness the authoritarian power of the state to seize wealth from their fellow man and give it to themselves in what I consider a narcissistic pursuit. In my opinion, the free market is neither a servant of one person nor a caretaker of anyone. I believe that if we have problems as individuals with the way wealth is distributed at the end of the day in a market, then each person who feels that way can voluntarily choose to give up some of his or her wealth in order to solve that problem.
It seems to me that any economic system or policy which is not built on a strong foundation of morality is bound to fail. For this reason, I'm not up here today to claim that, socialism sounds great in theory, like most people want to, but that it's not going to work in reality. I strongly believe that it's capitalism and not socialism that is morally right. That if we really believe that we are individuals, capitalism is the system that we have to embrace. Capitalism is the alternative. Socialism is not. We do not live in a capitalistic society right now. We live in a corporate state run by private interests and lobbyists that try to take control of political power to manipulate our wills and elevate a certain elite group to the top. We need to eliminate that. We need to get rid of government control, not give them more power. They're the reason why we're in these problems. I believe that two of the most beautiful sentiments of classical liberalism are that of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, like my fellow capitalist talked about. Self-ownership is the idea that I own myself. Nobody else does. Nobody has a right to exploit my time, talents, or property for their own personal gain. I own myself. I can do with my talent as I wish, right? This principle implies that it's fundamentally wrong to claim as your own the life or liberty of another human being. This, along with the non-aggression principle, which states that it is immoral for any person or group of people to initiate the use of force, imply what is at the heart of my belief in capitalism, which is consent. Capitalism is all about consent. Nothing can happen in a capitalistic society unless both parties agree to it. Capitalism is all about interactions between consenting adults.
Thank you. Right.
Yeah, okay. I guess where my views of capitalism come in is based upon, I guess, my interpretation of John Rawls's his difference principle from his veil of ignorance. I believe that capitalism is the best way to alleviate poverty. Since 1970, the amount of people living in poverty throughout the world has been reduced by 80%, from 25% of the population to 5% of the population. That's from the Bureau of National Economic Research. I believe that this system of capitalism is the best way to fight poverty and to fight injustice. I agree with Ryan that right now we don't live in a purely capitalist state. We live in a crony capitalist state that's more akin to aristocracy than a purely capitalist system. And I think we do need to change that, and we need to get lobbying out of politics, because that really prevents the government from representing the interests of the American people. And I believe that a purely capitalist system without any interference from lobbying and corporate interests is the best society in which we can live.
Wonderful. So now that we have an overview of all of our panelists' perspectives, we're going to start into our general topics on the American economy and wealth inequality. So here we have 3 questions that fall under this. We'll start with the first question. I will allow the capitalists to go first on this question, and then we will rotate on the next. The question reads, before turning to more specific issues, should self-interest be the should self-interest be the source of action around which the economy is based? Okay, so starting first.
Sure.
Great.
So with regards to self-interest and capitalism, there are 2 main arguments. One is a collectivist argument, one's an individualist argument. So the collectivist argument is generally given by Adam Smith. He states that the nature of human beings is to compete, but this drive towards competition can be harnessed in order to benefit society as a whole. This is generally done through the economic means of wealth production that I've talked about earlier, wherein individuals as entrepreneurs develop new technologies that will raise the standard of living of their fellow men. In doing so, they generally drive down the cost of goods such that people who are poor or who have fewer skills that they can market can afford a higher standard of living and a higher sense of effectively sense of self-esteem in the world. The second is a more Randian individualist argument in which human self-interest can be considered something that empowers us as people. If we are more in tune with our own personal desires and our wishes in life, we can more accurately pursue them, and we can feel like we own ourselves in a way that's quite diminished by seceding our own interests to the whims of a large majority with political power. I personally believe that the economy should have no moral compass thrust upon it, as people as individuals each have a specific lifestyle that will effectively make us happiest. And I think that no other person can determine that for us. It's something that we have to look inside ourselves and find. And if we allow the capacity to achieve that be sent away to the people who can't read our minds, can't understand anything about our lives, through a vote that they can distribute wealth however they wish, I believe that will lead to a more miserable populace.
Right, just under time. Thank you. So you all will have 2 minutes to respond.
So I think if you look at our everyday lives right now, you'll find that really in many ways outside of the economy, we already operate in a way that it's not based on self-interest. I think it's David Graeber who writes about this, and he calls it everyday communism, which is a sort of provocative term, but I think he chose it for a reason. The reason being that, like, when we exchange gifts as presents, or when we help someone on the street who has dropped something, all things like this, these are acts that are not self-motivated. They are from the sort of naturally altruistic motives of humanity. And I think that insofar as that's the case, that we see these on a like normal everyday level, I think we can organize a society around that natural tendency of humans. Jessica told you about this when she talked about the ways that Adam Smith described society, that is, working together to become the dominant species on Earth. And I think you'll find that we can create an economy that harnesses that and doesn't have these sorts of collective action problems that the status quo sees, where, you know, no one can be the first to act because it's too costly.
And I think there also is a problem of the right does not have a monopoly on the concept of self-interest. Well, like socialists are broadly self-interested. If you look at self-interest as something that's collective, I mean, it's not in our collective self-interest to ignore climate change and have our grandchildren living in bunkers. It's not in our collective self-interest to have a couple very, very rich capitalists owning all of the productive forces of the economy. For the vast majority of people, capitalism is not in their self-interest. The only people who it's in the self-interest of, capitalism is in the self-interest of, is the people who own the market, is the people who own capital. And that is not the majority of people. That is not 99% of people. So capitalism is antithetical to the self-interest of the vast majority of people.
All right, so we have now 4 minutes for each side to engage directly with one another. So if you want to start, I will start on this side.
Sure. So I believe the socialist side has raised 2 points that I believe are essentially fallacies. The first is that altruism is a ever-present aspect of life. I don't think true altruism actually exists. I believe that when people are helping each other, and for example, if you live in a family, I think people generally are aiding each other in order to make themselves feel something better. I think this is inherently self-interested. It's not any collective goal to improve society as a whole. It's something to make yourself feel like a good person. And I think this is generally a conditioning thing we do, where we're told that good people will help you on the street. The good people are going to take care of their families. This is something that we've conditioned people as a society to do, and it's generally a self-centered way to live. The second is that wealth is a fixed quantity in society. So the idea that because a few people own large amounts of wealth, that everyone else is inherently worse off is simply a lie. Wealth changes in an economy year to year. GDP grows about 3% every year in America. As well, you can't misconstrue relative poverty as absolute poverty, which I think socialists tend to do quite often. The fact is, the poorest people in America today have a higher standard of living than Rockefeller during the 1920s.
All right.
I'd like to respond with a question, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who said this, but saying that poverty was reduced to 9%, it was a statistic by the Bureau of Economic Research. I want to know what the dollars they are surviving on per day by their measure.
I said it was reduced by 80%, not 90%. And it's basically just the, it's inflation adjusted. And then I'll be happy to send you the data after this debate.
It was reduced to 80%?
It was reduced by 80% from 25% of the world population to 5% of the world population.
Okay, so on $1.90 per day, the statistic I have is 10% of the world. If you don't count China, which is a planned economy that brought a lot of people out of poverty, the proportion of the world that has remained impoverished is about 60%. And I don't think that $1.90 is enough to live on. And there's another measure that 4.2 billion people are living on $7.40 or less per day. So I just want to put some accurate statistics out there for the poverty measures.
I think that claiming that the success of China in recent years comes from the planned economy is a little bit reductive in the fact that since 1978, when market aspects were introduced in China, over 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. It's the market aspects that have lifted those people, not the planned economy. If it were the planned economy, Mao's China would have been vastly more successful than the United States.
Additionally, I would like to add that China is not really a democratic state. It's an authoritarian state in which many of its citizens don't have any rights. Look at the Uyghurs being imprisoned. Look at the Tibetans. They don't have any rights. So I don't really think that China should be included in this part of the conversation. Additionally, if you'd like to send me where you got your numbers and information from, I'll be glad to speak with you after the debate.
I think I just wanted to respond to that broad claim by the capitalists that self-interest is really the only source of organizing our economy. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is that really how we want human civilization to function? We just want to hope that everyone, through somehow acting in their self-interest and only caring about themselves in the very short term, we're going to somehow turn out into a economic and political system that's fair and democratic. I think that's not been the case now. We don't live in anything close to an egalitarian economic system, and that's not going to be the case into the future. It's only going to become more unequal if we only care about self-interest.
Okay, so we started to talk about global inequities in some of the comments that have come up. The next question that we're turning to now is, how can socialism or capitalism address socioeconomic inequality? So part of that has been picked up on, but we can continue now. You all can start.
So since 2005, more than half of the global wealth has been in the hands of the richest 1% of the population. And while we've seen global GDP growth, in the US, Thomas Piketty shows that over the last 30 years, the growth in the incomes of the bottom 50% has been 0, whereas incomes of the top 1% have grown 300%. This goes beyond the haves and the have-nots. We need to address the intersectionality of race and gender. Capitalism created a platform to produce and exacerbate racial inequality. It has been the means of disproportionate exploitation of non-white peoples within our country and on a global level. I speak for 100% of the women on this debate stage when I say that gender disparity and rethinking gender in society are two of the most important socioeconomic considerations of our time. The market economy decides who makes a dollar off of who and who makes a dollar off of what. Socialism suggests that the people should decide. Socialism would bring public ownership of society's productive wealth and democratic control of resources within our borders. In the modern economy, production is now more necessary for the employment it provides than for the goods and services it supplies. Some people are poor and some people are rich, and a market cannot work to address the needs of the former. The economy produces a lot of things that rich people can buy, like Fitbits, and not a lot of things that poor people need, like affordable medicines. Democratic socialism allows us to produce what the majority of people value. Today, we see people using technology, namely algorithms, to be infinitely more productive, making wealth accumulation all the more easy and all the more exclusive. Looking to the future, now's as good of a time as ever to adopt a more socialist approach. So technology will be harnessed for the interests of all people.
Turning to our capitalists, you have 2 minutes on the clock.
So I know I sound kind of angry when I'm talking about these things. It's mostly because of my voice, but I believe that first and foremost, we're all equal in our humanity, right? And as such, we must all be treated with respect as individual agents, free to act according to our desires, right? Therefore, I believe that the greatest inequity, injustice that we can commit as a society is to rob an individual of that ability to act according to their desires. This is exactly what socialism does. By decommodifying labor and denying personal property rights, socialists actually promote inequity by denying individuals that's which most basic to them, the ability to follow what they want to do, right? I suspect, however, that by inequity, what we really want to talk about here is inequality, right? And capitalism doesn't have any mechanisms to limit inequality. And honestly, I'm going to say something that I think most of you are going to find shocking. I think some level of inequality is a good thing. It's not bad that we're unequal. Inequality drives people to better themselves. It drives me to be a better version of myself, to make myself better than what my parents were. What's actually bad isn't inequality, it's poverty. It's not the fact that there's a difference between the richest and the poorest, but that there are these poorest people, right? That's the reason why, in the past 100 years, capitalism has lifted so many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We can see this in the list of the most capitalist societies on earth. They're generally the happiest and the most wealthy, right? Even countries that our socialist friends are going to want to claim, like Sweden, Denmark, they're much more capitalist than they are socialists. Really, I believe that this question addresses an issue that we need to talk more about. How can we lift people out of poverty, not how can we limit wealth?
Okay, thank you. Wonderful. So we have a response. You can start. 2 minutes.
So yeah, I just wanted to start with addressing that initial claim that we're all individuals and that capitalism allows individuals to do what they want. And I think what he meant to say, at least, was that capitalism allows capitalists to do what they want. But for the vast majority of people who have to sell their labor to survive, who are dependent on their boss for their insurance, who are dependent on their boss for their housing, for their food, those people are not free to do whatever they want under capitalism. They have to work to survive. They have to do what their boss tells them to do. And unless you own a significant portion of the capitalist society, you can't just do whatever you want. You are subject to the coercion of, if you do not work and sell your labor, you will starve or you will die. That is not the sort of system that we want to live in. That's the sort of system that we might have lived in 200 years ago, but in a modern society, that's not where I want to live, or that's not where I want my kids to live.
1 more minute.
I just want to add something about, they talked about the, inequality isn't a bad thing in of itself, and what's important is reducing poverty. And maybe this is the case if you're like Nozick, but even Nozick would say that you have to acquire the things that you have in a just manner. And if you look at the history of exploitation of the global south, if you look at the history of racism in this country and in all countries, if you look at the history of sexism and all these sorts of biases that exist, it's not the case that the people who have capital now have it because they've worked harder. It's because they stole it from people. It's because they robbed lands of their natural resources and profited off of it. Those people having more wealth isn't a result of they working hard and having motivation to do that. It's the result of them inheriting the money that was robbed from other people. So what this question is about is socioeconomic inequality, and this inequality maybe is okay in itself, but if it's going to be an okay as of itself, it needs to be for just reasons and not for historical injustices.
Well, thank you. All right. You will have 2 minutes.
Yeah, Bill.
So in my opinion, I think the discussion of inequity is pretty much useless in a discussion of economic systems. I think economic systems themselves don't have moral codes. If they did have moral codes, they'd be exploited quite heavily. I think morality is something determined by each individual, and each individual can follow his own moral code as he sees fit with what he owns. I think that if you force morality on other people, I think, for example, at Brown we have a very liberal culture. If we applied the same idea of forcing your morality on people through the economy as in the social sphere, I think most people at Brown would be up in arms. For example, if a social conservative wanted to use the government to force their morality for gay marriage, most people at Brown would be completely enraged by that. But when we say the same about the economy, everyone claps and snaps. But so in my second point, I think that inequality truly isn't a problem because when our entrepreneurs create new technologies and raise the standard of living, they generate more wealth. I can't stress this enough. The lie of socialism is that wealth is a fixed quantity. It's never been true, never in history. So, okay, that was pretty much my part. But
Add?
Yeah, no, I want to respond to Jiraj's initial point about people being coerced into doing work that they don't want to do. I personally believe in a regressive income tax or universal basic income so that everyone can receive what they need to survive. I don't believe in a purely capitalist libertarian system in which people don't receive what they need if they can't make a living or if they lose their job or anything. There should be some sort of safety net to help these people. But I think that people should have the choice of how they spend their money and how they want to live their lives, not the government.
Thank you. Right. That brings us to our next question. Question 4 is about what role, if any, should the United States government play in the labor market today? In particular, looking at views on the U.S. Guaranteed welfare, union protections, and minimum wages or wage legislation more broadly. Right, I believe you all start.
So I think there's two different things that, two broadly different things that socialists are thinking about when we think about this question. I mean, in the short term, obviously, we do want to guarantee welfare. We do want union protections. We do want a minimum wage. Because essentially, we are arguing for a society that serves people, right? You shouldn't have to starve, or you shouldn't have to not be able to afford housing just because you're poor, right? We live in the most productive society in the world, in the history of the world. We should not have people starving or lacking for housing, right? And these mechanisms by the government are mechanisms to do that. But I think in the long term, what we have to think about is under a capitalist system, when there's a concentration of economic power like we have now, where a couple people control more wealth than a couple billion people, there's going to be a concentration of political power, right? So in a politically dynamic system, what that means is, in the short term, yes, you can have a social democratic system with welfare, with unions, which can help people and make sure that they have a good standard of living. But in the long term, what we see happens is that people who have economic power, they make sure that those protections are rolled back, right? Look at something like Sweden and Norway, which the capitalists were talking about in the past. Those were social democracies. But for the last couple decades, the owners of capital in those countries have been fighting the entire social democratic framework that was set up decades ago, right? So if you don't have a fundamental restructuring of the economy where companies are owned by the workers rather than by a few capitalists, where you have workers managing themselves, where you have a system where the economy by its organization is making sure that everyone has enough to live, everyone is able to eat, right? If you don't have that socialist system, you're not going to be able to have a just, democratic, fair society.
So I believe that no service can be provided by the state without leeching off the success of entrepreneurs. I think we should stop kidding ourselves and pretend that tax money just comes from nowhere. It has to come from a destructive process of taking wealth from some and giving it to others. For example, and for what's baffling to me as a libertarian is that people apply a different standard to government than they apply to individuals. Most people in this room and most people in society would agree that it's morally wrong to knock your neighbor's door with a gun and demand that he give you his money. But when the government does it, it's completely permissible. We don't bat an eye. In fact, most people clamor to raise taxes. In my opinion, in-kind transfers and welfare benefits, beyond just encouraging a general culture of aspiring towards mediocrity, if you have a complete safety net, people don't have an incentive to go beyond that. They also must take from hardworking people in order to support themselves. Do you want to talk about immigration? I apologize. I don't want to. Yeah.
One of the biggest ways that the government meddles with the labor market is through restricting immigration. We believe that one of the key tenets of capitalism is encouraging the free movement of people into and out of the United States. We believe that capitalism is the only system capable of allowing these mass migrations of people from low-income areas to the United States to be more productive. Capital in the U.S. is more productive than in other parts of the world, and that's why we want to encourage the U.S. to stop limiting the number of people that can come into the U.S., allow for more free migration, and allow for more economic growth.
Okay. Anything else? You have 20 seconds.
Oh, sure. So our friends over here noted that the Nordic countries are, for example, are somehow an example of socialism. I'd like to point out that every Nordic country that has a large safety net has a more free market with so many fewer regulations than America. I would love to adopt that part of the Nordic system.
All right, thank you.
I just wanted to respond to that claim about the Nordic countries. I actually said that I would agree that the Nordic countries are very capitalist. They are social democracies, but they still operate within a capitalist system. And I'm sure maybe if you support those social democratic policies, that's fine. But what's happening in the Nordic countries right now is that all those protections for workers, all of those social democratic policies are being rolled back by political parties backed by powerful economic elites, right? So the problem is if you don't transform your economy completely from a capitalist to a socialist system, the concentration of economic power, which is inherent in capitalism, is going to translate into a concentration of political power, which is always going to fight the interests of the vast majority of people.
I'd like to follow up first with the point that entrepreneurs are the ones producing money or value in our economy. I don't think that an entrepreneur has any action in producing lumber that we extract from the forest. I don't think that an entrepreneur does anything to produce the oil and the reserves that fossil fuel companies extract. I don't think they have anything to do with coal production in the coal mines. So I would push back on that and say that a large portion of our economy is through the extraction of natural resources on the planet, and I want to question what we're inviting immigrants to come and join. We have people working over 40 hours per week doing jobs they don't enjoy and still not making enough money to live.
And I'd just like to say about the point of, you wouldn't have, basically the point that the state is a form of coercion. I mean, I'd push back on that by saying, when a capitalist who owns some capital, right, let's say the owner of a factory, has 10 or 20 people working in that factory who are actually producing the goods that they're selling to make money, right, the person who owns that factory really isn't contributing anything to the production, right? But despite that, the person who owns the capital is the one who gets all the fruits of what the workers produce.
Right. Dusty round. Okay, so we're going to move on to question number 5. Question number 5 now turns our attention to how it is that the various different systems of social organization, socialism, or capitalism can respond to climate change. So our capitalists are going to be starting this round, and you have 2 minutes on the clock.
Okay, all right. So I first want to start off by saying that 99% of scientists agree that the climate is changing. It has always been changing. It's been changing since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the world. There's one group of scientists who believe that eventually, maybe in 50 years or so, that the consequences of climate change will be disastrous and affect humans. There's another group of scientists who we like to call the skeptics, who don't believe that climate change will affect human life, and even if it will, people will be able to move to other places, move to other parts of the country, parts of the world. We have technological advances that really can help people move anywhere in the world. And then there's a third group of people that are politicians, environmentalists, students who use climate change as a political issue to try to garner support. And I really don't think that the conversation should be had between politicians, even people like us, and that the conversation should be instead had by scientists. I really think we have no right or business discussing a climate change and the solutions to it, and that should be left to the scientists. And if any of you guys wanted to add anything.
I personally do. I mean, it sounds stupid to say I believe in climate change, right? Because it's real. It's obviously real. But I think that we do need to do something. I'm not sure that a purely free market solution exists. I think that the government does need to play a role in helping us address climate change. I would hope that that role would take a more capitalist feeling to it. I'm a big fan of cap and trade. I'm a big fan of these different policies that can help us lower our carbon footprint slowly so that we don't massively affect and displace workers in the process.
Thank you, right on time. Okay.
So I actually agree with the capitalists that we should listen to the scientists who are telling us that we have 12 years to take drastic steps or else we're going to be facing apocalyptic conditions. I don't want to live in a hellscape where we have to move people all over the world into like bunkers or whatever to survive. I think the only thing that we can do to stop climate change is to totally mobilize the economy. I think the only system that's going to be able to do that is socialism. Now, as the capitalists have reminded us a couple of times in this debate, capitalism needs to grow every year. They give the number 3%, that's about right. The problem with this is that if capitalism has to grow every year on a planet with finite resources, and the reason why capitalism has to grow every year is that there has to be new sources of profitable investment, capitalists have to compete, so they always need to find new places where they can make more money, and you have to find like new jobs for people displaced and unemployed by productivity increases. So if capitalism has to grow 3% annually and we have finite resources, there seems like a fundamental problem in that eventually we're going to run out of resources. Right now, private oil companies own about enough oil in the ground to destroy the earth 6 times. Those oil companies are not going to give up that oil without a fight. Instead, what we have to do is mobilize the economy democratically to use the things that we have to construct the infrastructure, the green energy, the things that we need to actually avoid a genuine climate apocalypse. Now, I think the important note here is that the green energy and green infrastructure that we build needs to be democratic. It is fundamentally unjust to let oil companies and private actors pollute the earth and push us to the brink of collapse for 50 years, 100 years, and then let them get rich off of it by building solar farms. The people who benefit from the transition to green energy need to be all people, and it needs to be done in a democratic way, right? When they tell you that this is the fundamental point, right? Like, unless we have socialism, the cap and trade policies are just going to displace pollution to the global south. They're just going to displace pollution elsewhere. And those regulations will always just be fought against by capital until they fall away. We need to mobilize the economy in its totality.
Thank you. All right. You have 2 minutes to respond.
Sure. I kind of differ with my colleagues here because I don't believe that there is any government solution to climate change. I generally think that, well, it's true that capitalism is the one economic system that maximizes the growth of technology. And I think that research and development efforts that would be bolstered by a truly free market system with no regulation and a higher level of competition would lead to more fruitful technologies that would help in combating the effects of a growing carbon footprint. Much more so than government, because as we know, government is a slow-moving, hulking behemoth, and it has a very hard time adjusting to very nuanced changes, such as to the climate. It simply can't move that quickly, and especially if you're having everyone vote in a democratic system. And it generally does a bad job of efficiency as well, because you lose most of your tax revenue in paying the salaries of bureaucrats who largely can't be fired due to the influences of public sector unions. So my solution to climate change is to deregulate the energy industry, open it up, allow for alternatives such as nuclear energy to be talked about, which a lot of people on the left don't like for some reason, even though it was very successful in France, about 70% of their energy coming from nuclear nowadays. And so I think there are other solutions than to completely abolish our ideas of natural rights. And also, I believe that if the world's going to end in 12 years, why do you care about any of the other socialist policies? Why do you want them in place? The world's just going to end. So I think it's a political lie. It's like the same thing with Al Gore theorized that Florida would be underwater in 2006. There are a lot of these crazy theories that are used to justify extreme encroachments on individual rights because people wouldn't agree to them otherwise. If people didn't believe the world was suddenly going to end, there would be no way they'd even entertain something like the Green New Deal.
Cool. Thank you. Response.
Yeah, I think it's really emblematic of the capitalist approach to the climate, where fundamentally the response by capital is, how about we do nothing really in the short term and nothing really in the long term to address what is fundamentally going to destroy the climate of this earth, right? And I think we also have to look at is, well, maybe the number is not 12 years, maybe it's 20 years, but what sort of system do we live in now? We live in a system where there is literally no economic incentive to address climate change. The only incentive under capitalism is profit. It is not helping the climate, it is not helping people, it is not helping communities. So if you have that as the dominant economic system, where the only incentive is profit, why would there ever, in 100 years, be an overriding incentive to save the climate from climate change?
I just want to real quickly hit the tech innovation point because I think this is counter to what we see. Like Wikipedia is like entirely developed by people for free. The polio vaccine, the creator gave away the patent for free because it benefited humanity. Like we went to the moon, the government did, NASA, also another country did it, maybe, or went to space at least. I don't think they were totally capitalist. So I think you'll find that there are other systems that can innovate.
Yeah, and I'd add on to that like even if you look at new forms of technological development, like a lot of computer science development, a lot of new languages are just open source, and those are a lot more robust forms of technological development than one person owning the entire code for something.
It seems commonsensical that the government does respond to climate change, but I want to offer an explanation as to why we haven't. So what I have here is the report on lobbying funds to elected officials in the U.S., and oil and gas gave our elected officials $125 million in 2018.
All right. Thank you.
Really bad.
Okay. We are moving into the last round of debate. For question 6, we're going to be turning our attention to what the government's role in healthcare should be, and specifically looking at a policy of Medicare for all or a single-payer healthcare system. Our socialists are going to be starting this debate, and
Yeah, so to answer this question, I think the government should organize healthcare provision. 34 countries have lower rates than the United States of death that could have been averted with medical care. All of these countries provide universal health care. The US spends more on healthcare than all of them. People are not seeking preventative care. They're waiting until their medical issues are so bad that they require more expensive emergency care, or they're not receiving care at all and they're dying. 45,000 a year. Medical bills are the leading cause of bankruptcies in the United States. Businesses will not hire full-time employees for the reason that they don't want to pay for their private health insurance. Roughly 35% of US residents are uninsured or underinsured because of prohibitively high healthcare costs. If Medicare for all is such a commonsensical approach, we're all probably wondering why we don't have it already. The question isn't so hard to find. In 2018, the number 1 and 2 lobbying industries in the US were pharmaceuticals, spending $281.5 million, and insurance spending $157.8 million. Notably, number 8 is hospitals at $101 million, number 12 and number 13 are health professionals at $91 million, and health services at $80 million. So 1/3 of the top 15 lobbying industries are healthcare related and make up $711.3 million. Our elected officials are paid to prevent us from receiving the healthcare we need because our economic system allows human lives to be a means for profit. A study at UMass Amherst revealed that healthcare costs could fall by 19% relative to the existing system with Medicare for all, saving the US $2.9 trillion while also providing healthcare coverage for all Americans.
we're capitalists.
All right. I think the biggest problem with healthcare right now is that we have too much monopoly and oligopoly in cartels and not enough competition. What the socialists are proposing is essentially a large monopolization of the healthcare industry, whether that be through the government completely taking over healthcare or through having subcontracts with insurance companies who overcharge the crap out of the government because they know that the government will pay them anything. Or whether it be the government running it itself, it will be a monopoly and it will be inefficient. Before the 1930s, there was a free market in U.S. healthcare. Health insurance wasn't a thing, and healthcare was affordable for most people. I really think the big problem came after the New Deal and FDR, when insurance companies entered the market and started demanding that hospitals charge lower prices, and in turn, the hospitals started making outrageous prices that people couldn't afford. And additionally, with the whole medical licensure system that we have, it's very difficult for new doctors to enter the system and for medical professionals to be held accountable. And I want to give my fellow people an opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I think what's completely ignored by almost everyone who talks about healthcare is that a large portion of the high cost of healthcare is the fact that we have a shortage of doctors in America. Most countries do. I think this is largely a problem with occupational licensing. In my opinion, as a libertarian, I don't believe in occupational licensing for any profession. I think that if someone can do a job, a piece of paper doesn't change their skill set. I think that we can evaluate what kind of doctor we want or what kind of professional we want, especially with the rise of technology like the internet, by looking at like reviews and how these professionals are evaluated by Americans and by private review boards. The American Medical Association is a private review board. They exist. Yep, that's what I'm done.
Thank you. Socialist response.
I'm going to start by saying that if we don't like the negotiation between insurance companies and the government or providers, an alternative to that is going on in England right now, where all doctors are publicly paid employees, and they have pretty great healthcare outcomes. I would follow up by saying maybe our shortage of doctors is because higher education is so expensive in the United States.
I would also suggest that when I keel over my inevitable heart attack, I would prefer not have to look up Yelp reviews for the guy who's going to be giving me my thing. So,
Professional review boards, American Medical Association.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And also, just I think more broadly, we can argue about how efficient healthcare is and if healthcare markets are efficient, but the fact is that in every single other developed country where you have a single payer system, it's cheaper, you have better outcomes, you have less mothers dying at childbirth, you have less children dying of preventable diseases, you just have better outcomes for less cost. Not in one country, not in two countries, but dozens of developed countries, right? And this is literally what is happening right now. So if we want to have an efficient social outcome where we are spending less money and having better outcomes, which seems like a pretty obvious decision to me, I think we have to have a single payer system and eventually a system like that in the United Kingdom, something like the NHS.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the studies about how healthcare spending decreases, what you have to note is that, well, government expenditures will go up. The total amount of expenditures from like all Americans, including private expenditures, go down. The reason being that the government can negotiate prices now with drug companies because they have a monopoly on that negotiating power.
Okay, thanks.
No.
All right. A response from our capitalists.
Yeah, responding about the healthcare in England. The healthcare in England is not the great system that you guys present it to be. The wait times in England can be up to 3 years for a minor surgery. People can't get medicine for arthritis and other basic conditions because doctors are very limited in their availability to treat patients. Like, they're a finite resource and they don't have the time or ability to treat all their patients. So it really isn't that great of a system.
Yeah, and I would like to address the occupational licensure hyperbole. You can ignore my point without addressing it, and that's perfectly fine. But the fact is that independent parties to observe doctors and to evaluate their competency already exist. That's not new. It's not radical whatsoever. The fact that we kind of are like conditioned in our society to believe that we need like a government stamp on everything we do in order to make it right. But it's simply a fallacy that's like led to us so we keep going to the ballot box and we keep giving them tax money. We can exist without burdening doctors more and discouraging them from joining the profession, and it's not something to be laughed at.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so we are now going to open it up after we've heard from both sides on these topics. We will, let's see, it's 8 o'clock already. We're going to 8:30. Okay, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I will go ahead and select some questions. If we start to pick up too many, then I'll collect a few and then we can open it up to the panel. Let's start with this gentleman.
Sure. So in my perception, it seemed like while the capitalists were sort of making broad, inherent ideological I guess, critiques of socialism, the socialists were more focusing their attacks on attacking capitalism at its worst, like attacking these very specific issues in the present world, which they did a good job of saying like may not be just because of capitalism. So I guess to turn it around, like how do the socialists like respond to socialism at its worst, like at its worst, like the maybe even hundreds of millions of people who died in communist China, or the tens of millions of people who died in Russia, like what is the response?
So first off, I would start by saying that we're advocates for democratic socialism, not authoritarian socialism, and that distinction is crucial to what we're arguing for today.
Socialism
the word
is
democratic
democracy.
in the upwards of hundreds of times in the last hour.
Democratic Socialists of America. No, but seriously.
To be fair, the definition was provided at the beginning, where they defined socialism as the full implementation of democracy was the starting position. Do you want to follow up with your question, though?
So is that your response then, that that's not real socialism?
I think we should note that it's largely incoherent to compare the death totals under any sort of regime at its worst. Like, I don't think this is a good metric of analyzing systems. If we really want to do this, we can talk about the genocides carried out by the British Empire. We can talk about all the sorts of disasters that have happened under capitalism, the millions of people who die every year because they can't get health care. We can rack up death totals all we want. I don't think this is a coherent way to do it. I think we did present ideological critiques of capitalism. That is to say that it depends on infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. That is to say it commodifies labor. That is to say it gives a few people the chance to lead the economy on the basis of nothing but sort of lottery of birth, of where they're born into how much wealth they have. These are all critiques that we've offered.
I would also follow up by saying we did not criticize capitalism at its worst. We criticized the conditions of capitalism as we see it today.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that there's only really one metric that I use to examine whether something is a capitalist or a socialist system, right? And it is whether the economy is owned by private individuals or is it owned socially through cooperatives or worker self-management. And in the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of China, both of those were in both those cases, the economy was owned by private individuals, which is not what we argue it for at all. And in the case of both of those countries, the political system was not democratic at all. So democratic socialism is almost the diametric opposite of those systems that you're referring to.
Okay, so we have some questions over definitions, but we're going to pick up a couple more questions over here.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the definition of democratic socialism. So, and also like the way that system exactly works, because part of the worry for me is that, let's say we create this socialist system where the government sort of manages and controls everything, and we democratically elect, representatives to help manage that system. The worry for me is what if we democratically elect somebody like Trump or Trump and worse, and now we're in a fascist state because Trump has control over the whole economy, can do whatever he wants. So I don't know, maybe I'm just don't know the definition properly, or maybe you guys have thoughts of solutions so that we can still maintain a democracy, but not have accidentally or foolishly give so much power to somebody that can maybe be super just too destructive to society.
I think that's actually a really great concern, and it's a concern with democracies everywhere, right? There is sometimes the rule of the masses not always intersecting with the best social outcome. But I think what we believe as democratic socialists is that democracy works, right? Giving people control over their lives works. And you have to expand that sense of control and that sense of access to everyone. You have to expand that past just the political system to the entire economy. And I'm a fan of the democratic system in the United States in a political sense, but it has to be spread to the rest of society, including the economy.
Great. And did you want to respond to that question at all?
Oh, I would love to. So I think it's intellectually dishonest to virtually dismiss the failures of socialism and the examples of socialism in its, as the questioner said, in its worst form, especially if you're going to use the British Empire as an example of capitalism. In free market capitalism does not involve state involvement in the economy. It doesn't involve colonization, and it doesn't involve the use of the state to extract any resource. It involves private actors doing as such. So I think that that's a little bit of, we're just talking past each other for the sake of theater, and I don't quite like that. And do you have anything?
Okay, you can pick this up, but we have a lot of questions and little time. So I want to get one from, yes.
Hi, yeah. I have a question for mainly you. I don't know your name, sorry. So you mentioned one thing that I just want to pick up because I think it's kind of at the core of the value systems behind each economic system. I believe when you were talking about social welfare, you said that, first of all, that there would be no incentive if there is a social safety net. And second of all, I believe close to your exact wording was that social welfare takes money from the people who actually work hard.
Sure.
I just wanted to question that assumption because I think it's kind of, I don't know, I wanted to explain, or not explain, I wanted to ask where you get the idea of monetary success being equated to labor or to effort, because I think it's kind of a fallacy to say that people who are on welfare, therefore people who have been affected by poverty, don't work hard, or that they somehow don't deserve to be in the place of those who do work hard and therefore have money, is essentially what you're saying. And I think it sets up a fallacy of a meritocracy. And I just wanted to ask, like, where you think that value system should lie. I mean, you said you don't think that the economy should have a value system, but it seems like in that statement you were valuing a certain type of labor over another one. So I'm just wondering, like, where your moral value system falls.
Sure. No, I have a value system. The economy doesn't. That's the point. And the other answer is that no one deserves anything. So I believe in more of a Nozick's version of libertarianism. And my idea of the welfare state being kind of parasitic is generally because, and the social safety net distorting incentives to work comes from a few real life cases. For example, the Finnish wrapped up a universal basic income experiment. They cut it off 2 years earlier than they expected because people stopped working when they received it. This is also something that we see in our unemployment insurance system, where when people collect unemployment benefits, they usually do so for the maximum amount of time and then apply for another job. It's usually about 6 months at half pay. My answer to this is generally that I don't want to enforce. I don't think that economy should be making judgments on people. Individuals have a right to think and say whatever the hell they want.
Can I just ask Adam a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You said you don't think anyone's entitled to anything.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
curious if you believe in wealth inheritance.
Yeah, well, I do. So, and it's not because of it's not because of a familiar thing. I think that if you own something, you have the right to decide who gets it. So you can do that through the market, and you can say that I can market my labor at a certain wage. I'm going to accept a certain wage. I'm going to look for jobs that fall in that wage range. Or you can say that if I own $100, I can choose whoever to give that to. I could buy something. I could give it away. See, the thing is that I believe in voluntary charity. Like the idea that capitalism is a merciless ideology and socialism is like the epitome of benevolence is just a lie, because socialism is the idea that you believe in charity, but you think that everyone around you should have to pay for it. So my libertarian idea is that if you want to help someone, help them, or organize a charity, raise money to help people. You do not have a right to take money from someone else at gunpoint, because remember, if you evade taxes, people in suits are going to come to your house. They're going to either throw you in a cage that the government says is jail, or they're going to shoot you if you resist that. There's not a choice in this. That's what I think is immoral about it. And so I generally focus on voluntary action.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's take a few more questions. One from the back here.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank all 6 of you for being here to argue and there's more civility in this room than on all of Twitter combined. So. My question is for the side that wants to destroy capitalism, so the capitalists. What do you do when consumers run out of money? You guys admitted earlier that you have no mechanics to deal with income inequality. 99% of all new income goes to the 1% in this country. What do you do when people can't buy their goods?
Well, you understand that if you understand market incentives, you realize that you can't get more money if people aren't buying your goods. So that it goes against the idea that people hoard money and they don't invest it and they don't put it in a bank. So if you even put money in a bank account, you are investing it because of our fractional reserve banking system.
He's asking about the other 99%.
What are you talking about?
He's asking about, I can let him clarify his question.
Well, you so but the.
Good, it's going to other capitalists. Yes, it's circling through people.
Well,
but
I can
that's very few
actually
people.
answer that question because it would work the same way that home ownership, car ownership, education works in this country, which is you put yourself in debt peonage so you can afford these basic things, and then you owe the rest of your life to a bank while you're paying all that off.
Well,
So that's how that.
Well,
Okay.
no,
All
no,
right,
the
hold
problem
on.
is okay.
Oh, we have to moderate this. I have to step up here. So,
Wait, can I,
Adam, no, I'll give this side another chance to respond, and then we'll take another question. So go ahead, both of you.
Well, the problem is a sense of entitlement. Like you don't have a right to any good or any intangible service. Like you have a responsibility to yourself in order to provide for yourself. You can't just take money from someone else around you. I don't think that's moral. It goes against my moral vision. Libertarians call it the non-aggression principle that you don't mug your neighbor because your neighbor could mug you. If you do that, you set a bad precedent. And the idea of credit as slavery is something that, or indentured servitude is in my opinion quite absurd because you choose to take on credit. And the way you avoid doing that is to develop a skill set that's marketable enough to earn a wage.
Okay, Adam, I'm gonna let.
yeah, I would have to respectfully disagree with Adam. I believe in a UBI or a negative income tax. People can get fired for any reason or lose their job for a number of factors, and hard work does not necessarily equal success. Usually, we equate the two in a capitalist system, and I think something we need to recognize is that hard work does not guarantee success. And we need a UBI or a negative income tax to ensure that people can live and have the ability to live and live how they want to live, how they choose to live, not how the government wants them to live, in the event that they can't make money through a job or other things. And I think the current welfare state we have in the country is shrouded in bureaucracy and does not give people the individual agency to make their own choices.
Thank you. I'm gonna give the socialist side a chance to respond because they were very interested in this as well.
I mean, I think this idea keeps coming up from the capitalist side of like the tax man's gonna come with a gun to your house and take all your money. But like, I think if you realistically look at the system we live in now, the inverse is true. Like capitalists are the people who are really saying, okay, if you don't work here, you're going to literally starve to death, or you're going to literally not have a place to live, or you're not going to have health care, right? For the vast majority of people, the problem is that under capitalism, they're being coerced to work. They're being coerced to be a part of the production system, even if they don't want to be, right? Because they want to survive, obviously. So there is the other side of that, argument that the capitalists keep saying of, well, in capitalism, sure, someone might say that they will work somewhere, but if they have to work there in order to survive, it's not really the most consensual action in the world.
If I can very briefly add, what the people who have the money under capitalism are the people who are offering you a job. So naturally, even if workers refuse to work and strike to get higher wages, the money of the capitalists will run out far later. So there's a structural imbalance that results in just workers not having power to just sort of choose their own wages in the market.
Right, up front here.
I just wanted to partly return to the examples of history where socialism has been implemented to what you talked about to its full extent of workers owning the means of production, the economy, running everything. And I'm, in real practice, just curious how that would work and how you would avoid an authoritarian system developing. And my, I guess, third part to that question is, how do you then allocate resources in an effective way when you're relying on workers to decide how that is done? Like, how do goods properly get allocated in that system?
Yeah, and that's actually a question that there's probably differences at this table about how we'd answer that in terms of social ownership of the means of production. I'd personally think that a market socialist approach is best. Having things called workers' cooperatives, which are companies which are owned by the workers which work there. So a place like Eastside Pockets might be owned by the workers of Eastside Pockets instead of whoever owns the actual restaurant, right? So, broadly, you see that working in workers' co-ops like Mondragon, which is the largest workers' co-op in the world. It has, I think, 170,000 employees, and each of those employees has a say in how their division of the company works. They can elect people to, run their division of the company, and there's more higher levels of democratic management of that company. So you have that democratic system of consensus building and of deciding what happens. You have that in the economic sphere, at least I believe, through workers' cooperatives.
Yeah, and the workers have the choice to join that company. They're not forced at gunpoint.
Yes, that is
Yeah.
a true statement that was just said.
Yeah. It's voluntary.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, right, like, a market socialist approach realizes that in a capitalist system, there's going to be other forces arrayed against cooperatives. So right now, capitalists are usually able to outspend those workers' co-ops. So in a market socialist system, there's going to be a mix between those workers' co-ops, between small businesses, and between state-owned enterprises who'd be maybe running more basic utilities, things like that.
Or should we take another question?
I mean, I can say.
You want it, Sean?
Yeah. So
Also, other socialists might want to.
Okay, we're trying to keep it about 1 minute on either side.
Yeah. So the main problem again is in the idea of what's voluntary action and what's involuntary action. So if the state owns an industry, or if a union was like threatening violence against workers, if there were strike breakers, for example, I would think that would be immoral under my sort of like moral vision of what should be done. And the idea that if like 51% of people vote that such a system is okay, I don't think that makes it moral or correct. I think that any use of the state to legislate behavior is completely wrong, and I would want to avoid that at any cost, and that's why I'm a libertarian.
Okay. Got one in front.
Going back to the question we had before, what place is individual? I feel like if the company is going to be owned by the workers anyway, they have a lot less. The company, it might be a lot harder for you, and in turn, that can be bad for society because it leads to less.
So what I would note is that if your company is something that is valuable, that is productive for society, say a vaccine, new technology, something like this, then there are already incentives for you to produce it, right? Like society as the whole gets better if you develop a polio vaccine because your family doesn't die from polio, even if you're not making profits, right? So it's not the case that there are just like market incentives for entrepreneurship. There are still mass societal sort of motivations for these sorts of things, why you might want to invent new things. Stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, you have shared risk and shared profits in terms of publicly owned companies right now, right? Like you have shareholders who are investing in companies collectively and also taking on that risk collectively, right? So if you just take that shareholder model and spread it to like all of the employees in a corporation, like you just basically transform that model. Yeah.
I would add that if the entire population is educated and has their basic needs taken care of, they have both far greater capability and likelihood to take risks and innovate without their life on the line and with the added benefit of education. I think right now there are a lot of what people are calling lost Einsteins in the global south that are unable to innovate but would have otherwise from a lack of education and fruitful upbringing.
Thank you, Jess.
The West and
right. So we can call this these developing countries. They're primarily in the bottom hemisphere of the world,
which are mostly socialist countries.
Not
Okay.
really.
Side talk. We have to take another question from the floor here. The gentleman right here.
I think I've got a question for the socialists. and this is about, it's kind of a two-part question. So I'd assume that would all of you say that you'd like a heavy progressive income tax?
That's a quick fire.
In the short term.
Just in general.
In the short term, that's
The
sort of
short term.
That's sort of within a capitalist framework of thinking about the economy, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Under capitalism, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So,
We'd be more interested in wealth taxes.
okay, yeah, so it's kind of like the same thing as taxing the
They're pretty different.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm saying is that a big part of socialist philosophy is the separation of the fruits of one's labor from their like actual work. And so how do you explain this to the businessman who starts up his own company just to have it taken over by the workers? And at least in terms of the Communist Manifesto and Marxism, in this kind of sense, usually that happens through some sort of force or coercion. I'm just wondering how you rationalize taking away the property of somebody, taking away the fruits of somebody's labor. So somebody goes and they form a company, and you go and take it away, and that's socialism. Isn't socialism supposed to be about uniting the worker with their labor?
I think that's a very narrow view of like how socialism can be enacted. I mean, I talked about workers' cooperatives earlier. Actually, what's happening right now is through ASOPs, a lot of company owners are selling their employees to their workers. And obviously, that's literally the only system to create workers' cooperatives in the United States. But like, again, you can have democratic reform of the economy and the political system. You don't need to have force to do that, and we're not advocating for a violent revolution in any form. And I think my fellow socialists here would agree.
Sure, but I guess what I'm saying is that isn't it kind of contradictory to the socialist mantra of not separating the fruits of one's labor from like the industry owner, the person who makes the company? Aren't they entitled to a large share of their company if they created the company themselves? Isn't that depriving them of their labor?
Yeah, they can be an employee of that company. Like entrepreneurs can be. Just because they own something in a capitalist framework doesn't mean that they are producing everything. The owner of a company isn't creating all of the productive energy of that company, right? Like what we're basically arguing is that it's fine. We love entrepreneurs, right? But entrepreneurs, just because of their access to capital, don't need to have an outsized portion of the income of a company, right? They can be paid more, but they don't need to control how that income is distributed in the first place.
I think I would also add that economic production comes largely from labor, and it's hard to think about a company from the context of someone else, someone different from us, someone marginalized. We don't often see the labor that goes into, say, what's produced out of a garment factory. You have people working for wages that they cannot live off of, laboring for 40 hours a week, and we think that they deserve more.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to cut this off really quick
Can I
because
respond to this question?
Oh, yes.
Do you mind? Okay. So the one problem I'm seeing arise is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how a business operates. For example, the people who start up a business or like a startup, people who begin a business share a completely disproportionate amount of risk relative to a standard worker. If the company, for example, if an entrepreneur starts up a company, hires 10 people. If that company fails, all that's going to fall on the entrepreneur. The only exception to that is that if under our current system, the government will bail you out if you declare bankruptcy. Libertarians don't agree with that. We don't agree with corporate welfare, the same as social welfare. But so an entrepreneur, you can justify an entrepreneur being paid more or taking a larger share of profits and output simply because they share a huge amount of risk that workers don't take on. If the company goes under, the workers aren't set back in wealth. They stay at the same level, and then they go and try to find another job.
Okay, so that's a great point. We have 2 minutes left, and there's been some people being very patient. So I want to collect 3 questions or so. We'll start in the back here.
Yeah. So from the libertarian side, I've heard that a way to alleviate like inequality and just like alleviating general poverty is a UBI. But given decreasing rates of home ownership and the like general prevalence of let's assume this is still within capitalism, what is stopping your landlord from just raising your rates? Or like, why wouldn't the market just respond to people having more money, therefore not raising the standard of living for anyone despite giving them more? Isn't it just like inflation?
That's a great question. I'm going to take a couple more. Yeah.
So I have a yes or no answer question for you, but then more in depth for you. Would you be okay with voluntary business licensure to set different businesses apart, where if someone engages in voluntary licensure and someone doesn't, the market will account for that? But more for you, I kind of very concerned that you think capitalism is coercion, and I first of all, would like to know if, for someone who wants it to be democratic, if a libertarian government or economic system were voted in, would you accept that? And I would like to know, did anybody force you to buy any of the things that you are wearing or using, or did anybody use coercion in that?
Okay, that's going to have to be it because I need to allow my panelists an opportunity to respond. Do you all want to start with the UBI question? And
Sure.
okay.
I guess like my response to it is I support rent control. That's a way to make apartments and houses affordable for people in the short run, while giving them time to look for a job in order to earn a living to make a down payment on a house if they want to own a home.
Can I also respond to the UBI?
Please.
So I think we should think about how UBI would play out in a capitalist context in the long term. A lot of people have thrown this out as the panacea to capitalist inequality. But if we think about it, UBI has been pitched at $10,000 to $20,000. And what this would really produce is an underclass of people living on this set income, while an overclass of people would maintain their wealth, have the means of production, so to speak, and it would create a huge polarity of two classes living in our country or our world.
And did you all want to respond to this gentleman's?
Yeah.
So in terms of coerciveness, I think the important thing to note is like, yes, in fact, I mean, I have to work to be able to afford the things I need at college. It's not the case that I can just refuse to, and I basically have to accept the wages that are offered because realistically, I can't just walk into the SAO and be like, I'm not working until you pay me $15 an hour, because then they just go, oh, well, we're just going to hire someone else, right? This isn't how things work. The bargaining power doesn't exist. So there is coerciveness in the economy to work at whatever wages the capitalists are basically setting. That is, I think, fundamentally the case.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to call this to a close.
Yes.
Yeah.
Joel, did you want to say anything else or close us out? If not, yeah.
Cool.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Join me in thanking all of our panelists for a really nice discussion. You guys were great. You were on time. Everyone was kind of flowing. I thought it was a really good discussion.